Just 1 second more. Okay, you're live.
Thanks, Kathy. Good evening, everybody. My name is Peter Murphy. I'm the MC for tonight's Politics in the Pub, Sydney Politics in the Pub. So welcome to everybody in our online audience. I want to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the custodians of the land on which I'm sitting tonight, and pay respect to their elders past and present, and acknowledge the First Nations peoples everywhere we are tonight. I warmly welcome, in particular, any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person attending the Zoom. Because of the pandemic situation, we have to hold this one online, even though Hotel Harry is now open. In the next, I'll make an announcement at the end about our next phase. So if you want to put a question or make a comment in the Q&A part of the program, you'll need to use the chat facility in the YouTube, which you can find by clicking on the promo slide for tonight's event at politicsinthepub.org.au. So our topic tonight, only the economy, Morrison's election platform. Well, right now, media attention is on the war in Ukraine and off the economy and the threat of global warming. But you can tell by the current floods in Queensland and New South Wales and the Labor victory in the Bega by-election last month that pandemic management and global warming remain big issues with voters for the coming federal election. But Morrison is really grasping at any issue to help his re-election. So tonight we've got two really fine speakers who can tease out what's happening and have a critical look at the way Morrison is shaping up. So we have Mark Ogge. He's a principal advisor at the Australia Institute. He's widely published on climate and energy issues and specialising in the gas industry and the impacts of climate change, particularly the effects of heat and heat waves. He also takes the Australia Institute's research to regional communities across Australia, particularly those impacted by the expansion of the coal and gas mining. Prior to joining the Australia Institute, he was a director at Beyond Zero Emissions. And Frank Stillwell, you should be familiar with Frank. He's a political economist at the University of Sydney, well known to our audiences at Sydney Politics in the Pub. Along with Ted Wheelwright, Margaret Power, Evan Jones and Gavin Butler and thousands of students, he helped establish an independent political economy department at the University of Sydney. His research interests include theories of political economy, urbanisation and regional development and inequality, Australian economic policy and the nature of work. His textbooks are standard teaching material for all university students in Australia studying in that field of political economy. Now, Frank and Mark are each going to speak for up to 20 minutes. Then we will move to a question and answer session through to our 7:15 finishing time. So our first speaker tonight will be Frank Stillwell. So please welcome him to the microphone. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you, Peter. I have to say, by way of introduction, the Program Planning Committee for Politics in the Pub has a pretty good, sometimes even uncanny track record in timing its topics in relation to important national and international developments, but not really this time. The advertised topic on the economy and the forthcoming election has really been knocked a bit sideways by the terrible situation that's recently developed in Ukraine, as you said in your intro, Peter. The political ramifications for Australia, I have to say, are trivial relative to the humanitarian and geopolitical implications, both in Ukraine and globally, which are immense. But certainly war does add a new dimension to local politics, and war in general tends to favour incumbent governments, especially those of the political right, I believe. And Morrison, Dutton and co have already been beating the drum anyway, even before the Ukraine situation developed, with the drums of war in relation to China, at least in part, I presume, because they think looking tough will have a positive electoral payoff. Indeed, it may, notwithstanding the foreign affairs of the policies of the two major parties don't look fundamentally very different. But so-called national security now has become a yet bigger concern, I would guess, because even though we're a long way from the arena of conflict in Eastern Europe, it changes the national conversation. It adds another dimension to the more parochial concerns about the state of the Australian economy. And also, I think looking beyond the narrow interpretation of our topic tonight to the broader questions of what will determine that electoral outcome in presumably May, when the federal election is held, I would argue that there's perceptions of quite a wide range of issues that are pertinent here. I do emphasize that word perceptions because it's not just the reality, but how people perceive it that determines their political and particularly their electoral behavior. Five are, in my mind, first and foremost, it seems, the security of the nation. Who is perceived to be the better party for managing that? Second, the economy, yes, our topic as advertised. Who's the better prospect for good economic management? Thirdly, public health. Of course, that's been such a dominant concern over the last couple of years, in particular with the COVID pandemic. Question, who's the better for dealing with this sort of health crisis issue? I mean, a generally fairly compliant opposition has indeed taken plenty of opportunity over the last 2 years to criticise Morrison's handling of that, and we can expect more of that in the run-up to the election, because this isn't a pandemic that's sort of over, notwithstanding relaxation of some of the sort of lockdown regulations and so on. We're going to have to be living with these kind of situations for a long time to come. And then, of course, there's the climate change issue. Who's perceived to be the better manager there? And also my sort of bottom line issue in this checklist is the matter of public integrity. Who's the least corrupt? Who's strongest on public formation of bodies like an integrity commission? What about gender equality, the safety of women in workplaces, including in Parliament itself? Perceptions about the two parties, the two major parties and their leaders on these issues, all of them will be very important. And it's by no means an exclusive list or exhaustive list, because public service provision, who's better likely to deliver good childcare outcomes, education policies. And indeed, these are areas where the ALP is often said to have a comparative advantage. I was looking at an issue of the Saturday paper recently, for example, and here's a paragraph which succinctly summarises that view. The Liberals want the debate to be about national security and the economy. Labor wants the debate to be about better social services, childcare and the cost of living. The Greens want it to be on climate and the environment. But of course, all the contending parties have to have policies across the full range of issues. The ALP has decided early in its term of opposition on a fairly low-key strategy, particularly when COVID struck. They took the view that it was necessary to be seen to be cooperative with the government, at least in respect of achieving good health outcomes or the best possible in the circumstances. And more generally, the low target strategy has involved minimizing differences until the election is nigh, putting the emphasis on values, on probity in public office, having a credible alternative front bench, and in particular a creditable alternative PM, Albo as leader, trying to manage that balance between sort of being himself, the knockabout character who actually is quite, on a personal level, genuinely engaging rather than sort of Morrison's act. I think Albo has actually strong credentials for being a person of the people. And now he's off the grog, he's slimmer, he's got new glasses, a new suit, he's looking the role, looking the part, looking electable. And but when it comes to the crunch, their strategy is to let the Morrison government lose. They're not putting an exciting or enticing alternative. They're just presenting a rather conservative stance and posture in the expectation that this government has done enough to lose, and indeed it has. But the failure to grasp a more inspiring alternative is particularly worrying, troublesome, surprising, because there's such an obvious one waiting in the wings, some kind of Green New Deal, which would involve recovery from this COVID recession crisis situation, not just on getting back to where we were before, but in moving forward to a different set of economic arrangements that take on board all the concerns about climate change and the need for ecological sustainability, but which also take on board the need for job programs as workers transition from old sort of sunset industries into sunrise industries. Here's a context in which I mean, it doesn't take a great strategic genius to write the ALP political economic program. It's just crying out to be done. And ever the eternal optimist, I'm just hoping that if they are elected, preferably on a basis with a number of Greens and progressive independents also being involved, such policies could be fairly quickly implemented and given, therefore, a plan for a more progressive, equitable and sustainable future. Now, in beating the drum for the ALP in that way, I'm just sort of talking the bleeding obvious. I'm not actually a member of the ALP, but I really think that the time has come when they've got to form an alternative government, hopefully, as I say, in collaboration with those other important participants who I expect to do rather well this time. And let's face it, even if there's some kind of perception that the ALP is not a strong party when it comes to economic policy, the track record says otherwise. I remember of course, as we all do, the global financial crash of 2008, 2009, Kevin Rudd as Prime Minister, leading a Labour government that was effective in avoiding a recession in this country through its enlightened Keynesian economic policies in a way that made us one of the best performers, if not the best, in the whole world at that time. And think back yet further, those who are a bit more of advanced years, such as myself, to the Hawke-Keating governments in the 1980s and early 90s. Even conservative commentators concede that those governments laid the foundations for the overdue economic modernisation of the Australian economy, better performance, incomes policies, industry policies that provided a springboard for much of the economic progress that has been made since then. Indeed, unfortunately, relatively little economic progress has been made since then in terms of developing a more equitable, sustainable, productive economy. The Howard government years were years of doldrums in this respect. Policy drift, with just a strong reliance on revenues from resource extraction, particularly, of course, iron ore, to provide for the needs of the rapidly expanding Chinese economy. And since then, what have we seen from the Conservatives? Beating the drum about the need to get the federal budget surplus achieved. It was never achieved, even before the pandemic struck. And of course, during COVID, the economic difficulties ballooned. A massive public deficit and the growth of the public sector were one conventional manifestation of that situation. Of course, one thinks back to the Liberals' so-called debt truck a decade or so ago. I think it was in the Abbott era. The truck touring the country and displaying the latest mind-boggling dollar figure for the national debt for all to see. I think at the time it was around $150 billion, maybe a bit more. Chicken feed by current standards. The debt and deficits are now 5-6 times or more bigger than they were at that time when Liberals were saying how irresponsible Labour had been in running up these deficits and debt. Under their watch, the situation is a historic magnitude that is going to dominate conventional fiscal policy for at least a decade to come. Indeed, this is a situation where, not surprisingly, the government seems to have largely stopped talking about budget repair because it's so inconceivable that such debt and deficits could be brushed aside or even radically reduced within a matter of a few years. Although no doubt they'll continue to label the ALP as the big spenders. We ain't seen nothing like this since the last, relative to the size of the society and economy, since the Second World War. It's been the coalition, indeed, that have been the really big spenders, and a lot of it has not been terribly wise. With one notable exception, of course, during the onset of COVID, the temporary doubling of New Start when it was renamed Job Seeker was a long overdue in a measure that has a really discernible benefit for people in poverty. But the massive spending on JobKeeper, payments to bosses, ostensibly to keep their employees receiving wage payments, went to a considerable degree into increased business profits with firms who didn't really need that payment, and they got it anyway because its design made it unconditional on the use to which the subsidies were put. And of course, these deficits, debt mainly funded by the issue of government bonds. And here's a twist. The increase in government bonds mainly bought by the Reserve Bank of Australia, not buying directly from the government, as some people have argued, for example, in and around the Economic Reform Australia movement that they should be doing, but buying on a secondary bond market, a number of purchases almost exactly equivalent to the amount of new bonds issued. So effectively, this is a full embrace of quantitative easing, a policy that the Americans pioneered in the wake of the global financial crash, and which was enormously controversial at that time. A whimsical cynic might say underlying this might be some toying with modern monetary theory, but you'll never get Morrison and Freudenberg to admit to such radicalism. Has it all worked? What is the state of the economy? Well, of course, as always, it depends on the criteria by which you evaluate economic performance and economic policies. The coalition's emphasis, predictably, will be on the views of that well-known mainstream economist, Dr. Jobson Growth. Dr. Jobson Growth, yeah. Jobs, with a focus on the headline percentage rate of people who are unemployed, and growth, the rate of increase in gross domestic product, which is the conventional measure of the volume of economic activity in the economy. And why Dr. Jobson Growth? Well, doctor, because both sets of figures can easily be doctored. Unemployment, a measure that notoriously excludes anyone who had more than 1 hour of paid work during the week in question, and doesn't reflect the more complex problems associated with casualization of work, of insecure work, the development of so-called precariat. In other words, a very, very crude indicator of the health of labour market conditions. And growth, well, GDP as a measure of economic performance is, as even mainstream economists will concede, pretty shonky. It doesn't measure everything. It certainly excludes many things that do really matter. It doesn't take account of inequality, of pollution. It's a very poor measure of social well-being, but it does measure, in effect, the total volume of marketed transactions. Morrison, of course, won't acknowledge any of this because he just wants some headline figures and some rhetoric to say that the economy is doing well. And you could write the script for Treasurer Freudenberg when he brings down that annual budget on the 29th of March. Yes, an unemployment figure that now starts with a 4, not with a 5, maybe even going down to starting with a 3. Oh, wonders will never cease. GDP growth, impressive by comparison to previous quarter years' performance, but why wouldn't it be? If you're in a recession situation, any movement forward is going to produce rather impressive growth rates as a headline figure. More realistic economists like Ross Gittins will readily point to the need for a broader array of indicators to be taken into account, and I'm sure the electors, the so-called punters, will when the election looms. They'll say, what about wages and the cost of living? Stagnant wages, but escalating inflation in goods and services, creating a real squeeze for making household budgets stretch to meet all the necessary expenditures. Wages for most workers haven't risen in real terms for 6 to 8 years, but now inflation looks likely to surge, possibly even a repeat situation of the OPEC oil crisis in the 1970s, fueled by perhaps the situation with Russia, the embargo on its energy exports, pushing petrol prices up above $2 a litre and perhaps higher still, and flowing through into higher prices for a wide range of goods and services. And meanwhile, of course, housing prices have gone through the roof, increasing the housing stress for people trying to cope with the crisis of housing unaffordability and creating growing inequality between the housing haves and the housing have-nots. Now, from a coalition point of view, maybe the electoral support from home owners who benefited from these processes will be votes on their side of the ledger. But it has to be said against the many more people who've been excluded from the bonanza of increased housing wealth. So to move to a conclusion, it's far from clear that the current economic reality favors the coalition. It ain't necessarily so. And certainly if you introduce a broader set of criteria by which you judge the state of the economy and economic policy, the need for a radical change is yet clearer. Ecological sustainability, anyone? effectiveness of policies in managing a just transition to new energy and environmental realities, fostering new sunrise industries, innovation, real productivity. Do any of these things matter? Or should we just sit back and accept that the number one priority for public investment is purchase of nuclear-powered submarines to be delivered in approximately 20 years' time? Yes, folks, that is a rhetorical question. But to summarize, yes, there are some very real problems out there needing attention and redress. The government's economic management credentials are on a par with its COVID management credentials, muddling through at best, plus hopes and prayers, of course. No coherent plan, over 10 wasted years, stagnation, papered over by an unsustainable mining boom. Yet it is hard to unseat an incumbent Conservative coalition government. It's only been done by the Labour Party in Australia 3 times in 50 years. By Whitlam in 72, Hawke in 83, Rudd in 07. 3 times in 50 years it's been done. And so it's a big ask for Albo and his team. The Morrison government will play hard and dirty on the ALP as the election approaches. Palmer's money will flow in again, perhaps criticising both parties, but in ways that I think will be more damaging to the ALP. The Morrison government will weaponise whatever they can. Concerns with national security, patriotism, the last refuge of the scoundrel, is the first refuge for this mob, even at the cost of being socially divisive and taking resources from where they're better used in creating a good society. They'll try to weaponize the economy too, claiming to be inherently better economic managers and using scare tactics to paint their opponents as too high risk. But by the same token, here's a great opportunity for the opponents, whether ALP, Greens or Progressive Independents, or preferably some combination, to form a new government to develop a real plan for a better Australia.
Okay. Thank you very, very much, Frank. I think there's a lot of points there for people to respond to in the Q&A. Now I'd like to hand over the microphone to Mark Ogge, and let's see another perspective on the election platform shaping up. Thank you, Mark. You just need to unmute yourself. Okay.
No worries. Thanks, Peter, and thanks, Frank, and thanks for inviting me along to speak. It's really great to be part of this. Such a great program of talks. So, yeah, look, I wanted to talk, focus in on climate change and sort of go into the economic and energy debate as it relates to the election and some of the, and a bit of an evaluation of the government's policies, or at least my perspective on the government's policies. I just thought before I get into that, though, I would just address a couple of things that are obviously happening that are really important to the political debate. One is that, just echoing what Frank said, I'm just really appalled at the way the government is prepared to try and weaponise national security, particularly attacking China continually for its political advantage, because I think it's the way it's doing it is quite cynical and actually dangerous to our national security to be kind of not to say that there's of course there's reasons to be concerned about China, but the way they're doing it seems to me sort of picking unnecessary fights in a way that's very sort of very ham-fisted and that concerns me a great deal. The other thing is with the Ukrainian war, the government has is running the line that this is a wake-up call for energy security. Therefore, we, as a way of promoting more production of gas in particular, but fossil fuels, coal and gas for both export and use in Australia. Keith Pearce, the Resources Minister, has just given more money to fracking companies in the Northern Territory and explicitly said that that's the reason. And so government is spinning the kind of the energy security threat brought about by you know, because Russia's a huge supplier of oil and gas, particularly to Europe, and they're spinning that as a reason to double down on fossil fuel production. But the stronger argument, of course, is that being dependent on gas for any country is a major security vulnerability. And when renewable energy is way cheaper than gas in particular, it's obvious, and you've got electric vehicles, so you can actually, you know, very quickly reduce your dependence on oil and gas. There's huge opportunities for Australia and for other countries to shake off the yoke of fossil fuel dependence, which is always going to remain a huge vulnerability. I don't think we're really winning that debate at the moment, but I think they're really important points to be made. So the other big thing that's happening is, of course, you know, these incredible floods, which come, you know, on the heels of a couple of years ago, those massive bushfires, and we've also had fires and extreme heat waves in Western Australia recently. And so climate change is increasing the frequency and intensity of climate-related disasters. And the costs of this are huge. A few years ago, in 2017, the Deloitte Access Economics did a series of reports for the Australian Business Roundtable, which is largely representing the insurance industry. And they estimated the costs of natural disasters in Australia to be $18 billion a year, going up to $39 billion in 2050. Well, that research assumed that the frequency of natural disasters in the future would be the same as it has been in the past. And that was an obvious gaping hole. So they've recently redone that research, and except this time incorporating climate change and using some scenarios for various levels of emissions increases. And they found that they now estimate that the annual cost of disasters in Australia is $39 billion. So up from $18 billion to $39 billion now, to reach up to $94 billion by 2060, which is under a high emission scenario, which is a devastating economic cost. That's the equivalent of JobKeeper every year. So it's huge. And the Australia Institute has, we've long been talking about the terrible, aside from the terrible personal and human cost of disasters, the huge economic cost that's coming towards us. And our basic argument is that at the moment, the cost of disasters is entirely paid by ordinary Australians. So if it's government emergency response or relief after a disaster, or rebuilding during the recovery that comes from the government, that's our money, through its public money, which ultimately comes from taxpayers. If it's insurance, then that's ultimately paid for by everybody through higher insurance premiums or all insurance holders. And then, of course, a huge amount, probably most of the impact, is actually absorbed by ordinary people, either through uninsured property costs or personal injury or disruption and all of those kinds of things. So at the moment, we all pay for all of it, and we're going to be left carrying the can as this gets worse and worse. But of course, there is an alternative. Rather than us paying, the companies who are causing the problem could be paying, and they are the oil, gas and coal companies, the big fossil fuel companies. It's a fundamental principle of economics that if you cause damage, you should pay for it. Any economic actor, if they cause damage, they should pay for it. It's usually referred to as externalities. And no economist would argue with that. And yet at the moment, these big global companies who are producing coal and gas in Australia and oil in Australia and all over the world pay zero towards the impact of the damage that they're causing. And the entire cost is taken up by ordinary people. So what we're proposing is a levy on fossil fuel exports called a climate disaster levy. And for every tonne of embodied carbon exported from Australia, that money would go directly into paying for the cost of climate change, whether to help people in a managed retreat, to pay for emergency services, relief, recovery, actions for resilience to protect us from future climate change. All of these costs the fossil fuel industry could make a significant contribution to paying all of these costs. And if we don't make them pay it, then we will. And they're not going to be around forever. And they're making vast amounts of money. They're making windfall profits right as we speak. And if we don't get money out of them now, we'll be left carrying the can, and all of that wealth will be transferred to their shareholders. I just want to quickly play an ad that we've made to promote the climate disaster levy. So I will I'll just share screen for a moment, and I will play it. Sorry, sorry, I didn't check sound.
Meanwhile, gas and coal companies still profit from burning fossil fuels, which make these disasters more frequent and extreme.
Unbelievable. Can you hear that?
It's our communities who are footing the bill to rebuild and clean up the damage. It's time Australia had a levy on fossil fuel exports, so the companies that are fueling these disasters help by footing some of the bill for the recovery. Because if we don't make them pay, everyday Australians will.
So you could hear that okay? Yeah. All right. So I couldn't hear it. So there you go.
All right, it worked. Okay.
Okay. So anyway, I wanted to just cover off on that, on our work around disasters and the fossil fuel levy. And I want to then, if I've got a little bit of time, I just want to give a bit of an overview of some of the thoughts we have on climate, the government's climate policies at the moment. So, and Peter, jump in and tell me when time's up. Don't hesitate to do that. So I'll just share screen again. So yeah, so actually, yeah, so the first point I just wanted to make was that what governments tend to do is they will describe that they like to separate out what they call their climate policies from everything else. So what they're generally calling their climate policies are the policies that are aimed at reducing emissions. But of course, governments also have a whole lot of other policies that increase emissions. And so you don't really get a sense of what a government's climate policies are unless you look at both sides of the equation. And if you look at both sides of the equation, the policy of the current government is to massively increase Australia's emissions. Now, when I'm talking about that, I'm including our emissions that we export, which technically aren't counted in Australia because they are they're emissions from fossil fuels that we export that are burnt overseas. But of course, just in the same way as if we were exporting, say, asbestos. you can't shrug off responsibility for that just because technically it's not counted in your own accounts. So to give you a bit of a sense of it, Australia's annual emissions at the moment are about 500 million tonnes a year. Our current coal and gas export emissions add up to about 1.2 billion tonnes a year once those fossil fuels are burnt. And there's a list of projects that are under development that are published by the Office of the Chief Economist, called the Major Resources and Energy Projects. And if you add up all of those projects under development, all of the new coal and gas projects, that would add up to an additional 1.7 billion tonnes of emissions annually resulting from Australia's coal and gas. Now, to just put that into context, on the left-hand side there, I've got Australia's emissions in 2020. Next is the amount of emissions we would save, another 60 million tonnes annually on average by 2030 under the current government's targets. And then you've got the current emissions from Australia's fossil fuel, and then the additional emissions from the projects, the coal and gas projects that are under development. So you have to really, I think we have to take the whole view on that. And I've got to say, the ALP aren't much different. They might do a few things differently, but they basically support the development of these massive fossil fuel projects. This government is taking very proactive steps to make sure that those projects and either other projects that aren't included there go ahead. And one example of that is their famous or perhaps infamous gas-fired recovery project, where they're aiming to open up a whole lot of new gas basins in Australia. And these gas basins are and so these gas basins are scattered throughout Australia, but two of the one of the biggest is in the Northern Territory, the Beetaloo Basin, where a bunch of companies are proposing to frack, and the Australian government has a thing called the Strategic Basin Plan, where they're trying to connect that massive source of shale gas to the to the sort of existing gas network, and that connects that gas to export either from Darwin or through Gladstone in Queensland. And that basin is enormous. And the Northern Territory Fracking Inquiry in 2016 actually looked at the potential emissions from it. And under their high scenario, which is 1,240 petajoules a year, they said that could result in an additional 98.8 million tonnes of emissions annually, when you count emissions that will occur in Australia and overseas. So equivalent to 25% of our current emissions, and 40 million tonnes of that would actually occur in Australia, partly as a result of like methane emissions and production emissions, and some of the gas is assumed to be burned in Australia. So absolutely massive. And that is just one basin of several basins that the government is actively subsidising to try and fast track to open up. And the Beetaloo Basin, in terms of the overall size of the Beetaloo Basin, it's massive by world standards, but it's nothing compared to the Canning Basin in Western Australia, which the Western Australian government and the Australian government are both working to open up for export and for large-scale development. The amount of resource in the Canning Basin is shown there, and it's compared to the Beetaloo Basin and a whole lot of other basins. So it's potentially absolutely huge amount of emissions from these new fossil fuel sources that are potentially going to be opened up. On the domestic front, the way I'd characterise the Australian government's approach to domestic emissions is basically trying to slow down the decarbonising of the economy, because the economy is decarbonising anyway, because renewable energy is far cheaper than coal and gas already. So it's just knocking out power stations, Araring. I mean, it's happened to Hazelwood and Northern and Liddell and now Araring. So they're going down, but the government's just over time been trying to slow that down as much as it can. And a classic example recently is their proposed coal keeper. They wanted to introduce a coal capacity market where coal power stations are paid to stay open, even if they're not producing power, and that was kind of dubbed coal keeper. But there's many other examples, and they seem to have a preference to just slow it all down as much as possible. Look, there's a whole lot of other things I could talk to, and I won't. I'll skip a bunch. I wasn't going to talk about the disaster stuff before that, so I've added a bit. Just to say but what I did want to touch on was, well, a couple of things. One is, one of the government's favourite things to say, and a lot of people will say is that it's the "what about China" line. They'll point to China's emissions, and they'll often talk about the 43 coal power stations that China's planning to build. Well, China is leaving Australia behind in the dust in terms of renewable energy. The black area on that chart, that's the amount, that's the percentage of electricity generation from various fuels since 2005. The black area is coal, which is decreasing, and there's a
you need to switch the slide there.
Oh, sorry. So the black area is coal, which is decreasing radically, and a huge amount of renewable energy is coming online. So China is doing vast amounts. And just for a point of comparison, tying back into what I said before, this compares the potential emissions, 150 million tonnes a year from China's planned new coal power stations, to the potential emissions from Australian coal and gas production projects under development. Right, so I think it's really important because the government gets away with murder by always having this line about pointing to China. I don't really have time to go into it now, so I'll just brush on it, but brush over it, but a bit. But look, what we need to do is just roll out renewable energy as quickly as possible and electrify everything. Right, because renewable energy is already cheaper than coal and gas, and if you heat your houses, run your industry, and run your transport on electrified systems, then you save a huge amount of energy, you save a huge amount of money, and you can cut emissions to zero. So when the government talks about technology, not taxes, when they talk about technology, it sounds like, well, great, that's, we can start electrifying, we can start using renewable energy and all of those kind of things. But of course, they're not talking about that. They're talking about hydrogen and CCS, which are both distractions from the clear, obvious task that we need to do. And hydrogen, can definitely be a good thing, and will definitely have uses in terms of making steel and fertilizer. But as a fuel for transport, in Australia in particular, as a fuel for transport or heating houses, it's a ridiculous thing to do because there's so much energy lost in the process of making hydrogen. And the other really big concern is the emphasis on carbon capture and storage, because carbon capture and storage has been a massive failure. Every project, very few projects in the world have been successful, and the majority of projects in the world are called carbon capture and storage, but they're actually rebadged enhanced oil recovery projects. So what the oil and gas industry are doing is since the 1970s, they've had this process of injecting carbon dioxide underground to pump out more oil. It's a way of increasing oil production, and it's called enhanced oil recovery. And they just call all those projects carbon capture and storage, right? So they're injecting the carbon underground to get more oil out of the ground, and they're counting the carbon dioxide injected as energy stored, but they're not counting the additional emissions from the oil. So in fact, all of these projects, 3/4 of the projects in the world are enhanced oil recovery projects, which are almost certainly increasing emissions a lot, but they're being counted as emissions reduction by the oil and gas industry. So it's an absolute scam. And I'll just finally touch on this because it's important. The government has just developed a method where oil and gas companies can get paid for carbon capture and storage through the emissions reduction fund. So Australian taxpayers' money going to oil and gas companies to do carbon capture and storage. And that project was developed by the Clean Energy Regulator, and the Clean Energy Regulator, the key committee on that is called the Emissions Reduction Assurance Committee, which decides whether those projects have integrity, whether they're actually legitimate and will genuinely store carbon dioxide. The person leading that committee is a former head of APPEA, the Australian Petroleum Production and Exploration Association, the big oil and gas lobby group. While he was in the position, was the head of CO2 CRC, which is the CCS lobby group representing all of the oil and gas companies, and he oversaw the process for developing the rules for the CCS project. Our regulators are captured by the oil and gas industry, and it is a huge problem. I will leave it there because I know I'm over time, and I'll just quickly, as a final slide, I'll just reiterate that the actual solution is really simple. It doesn't require hydrogen. It doesn't, or not very much hydrogen. It doesn't require CCS. What it requires is rolling out renewable energy really quickly and electrifying everything. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Mark. I'd like to just pause and say on behalf of the audience to both Frank and Mark that we've had a high-powered, thoughtful, forward-looking presentation from both of you, and I hope we get some good comments and questions coming through now. So the first one is coming from Kathy, our tech person. She's saying, within the context of Europe becoming independent from Russia for energy, Ursula von der Leyen said, we must invest in renewables for more stable energy prices. I think we have to be very clear that the gas prices are skyrocketing, but the renewables, the prices have decreased over the last years and are stable. Shouldn't Australia be taking heed of Europe's reasoning?
Do you want me to have a go at that?
Yeah, Mark, I think it's your call.
Yeah, look, it's just an absolute no-brainer. Like, gas is incredibly expensive for any use, to produce electricity, to heat your house, and even in most industry applications, gas is just burning money. And on top of that, you have the disastrous kind of vulnerability of energy security, where you're totally at the mercy of global gas prices. Your imports or your exports can be disrupted, and in the meantime, renewable energy, even with the cost of additional transmission and the cost of firming power, so you can have power 24/7, is way cheaper than gas. So the only thing that's keeping gas going is intense lobbying from the gas industry and politicians who are buying it, as in accepting their lines.
Frank, have you got some thoughts on this one too?
My thought is yes.
Okay, we have a question from Wayne McMillan to both of you. What are our chances of moving to a steady state economy within 5 years? That's a different angle.
Perhaps I could have a go.
Yeah.
Since I've been member of steady state economy organisations, and in principle a supporter for trying to go down that road of getting off this sort of growth economy that is unsustainable, and frankly also ultimately rather unsatisfying. or maybe that's just the aging process. We're a little bit more skeptical about whether or not there's any accumulative benefits in consumerism. No is the answer. But whether it could be achieved within 5 years to get off the growth treadmill onto a steady state economy whereby we just concentrate on improving the quality of life rather than the quantity of stuff we produce, I doubt. The rupture to people's aspirations and expectations will be so great. Of course, in a crisis situation, the previously unthinkable can sometimes become necessary. And I think we may be moving increasingly to that kind of context, but any political party going to the electorate at this time with a steady state economy program will be whistling in the dark. So somehow or other, we've got to get down this road, get started on it, and try to open up the possibility of it actually coming to fruition. That's why I'm a supporter of a Green New Deal, whereas some steady state economy advocates aren't. They see this as just redirecting growth into, more green jobs, more renewables, less non-renewable energy sources, and so on. Well, yes, that's true in the first instance. But if we were to go in that direction, then presumably there's going to be contestation over how the policy might be pulled this way or that down the track. In other words, there'll be a contest between those who just want a GND, a Green New Deal, and those who actually want to use it as a transitional program towards a more comprehensive change in our economy that really transforms our relationship to nature, to each other, to social inequality, to consumerism, to the gobble economy. Well, let's get started, I say, and at least the Green New Deal over the next 5 years gives us an opportunity to change the mainstream political conversation in a way that then makes the move towards a more steady state economy feasible in the medium term. Now, of course, we haven't got forever to play with. These are urgent matters, but I think Green New Deal for 5 years, another 5 years of contestation about whether you pull it left or right, and then the 2030s as the era when actually a move towards a more stable, steady state, secure, equitable economy becomes a political reality.
Okay, over to you, Mark.
Oh, if we don't have a Green New Deal or the equivalent, starting in the next few years, we're going to have catastrophic runaway climate change. For people who don't want, a big rollout of renewable energy and all that kind of thing, the clear alternative is to continue burning coal and gas, which will tip us over the edge, and you'll never get a steady state economy because we'll be in Mad Max territory. So, and if you decouple energy use from emissions, and you also do things around, energy efficiency, which is happening anyway, like things are getting massively more, appliances are getting unbelievably more efficient. Houses are getting much more energy efficient. If you and you do stuff about about making things repairable and stop this kind of wasteful use of resources. If you do those things, there's no problem with using energy if you're not creating emissions, and your growth doesn't have to be growth in disposable consumer items and aeroplane travel. You can have growth in services and culture. Virtually all jobs in Australia are in the services industry, right? What's wrong with that? People want to do things with their life. They don't want to kind of sit around, and there's no need to. If you have growth in the services industry that are giving people fulfilling jobs, interacting with people, and pursuing things that aren't wasteful and destructive.
Okay. I've got a question relating to this issue that you both have just addressed. Like in the immediate terms, we've got a sort of centrifugal forces in the renewable energy debate, and we've got can-do capitalism, no can-do government. But we have got a New South Wales government which says capitalism will do it. So the Matt Keane approach is a market-driven, and it's shaping up. You know, he's getting lots of interest in his renewable energy zones. But it seems like we've got this significant problem that power stations are going to be hit, like they'll go bankrupt if there's no plan. We don't have a plan, so they are going to go bankrupt, and we'll have this chaotic transition take place. And the politics of that are very difficult. So is there any sign, with the Greens, the Labor Party or the Coalition, of addressing this problem? Because it's becoming like immediate. Okay, Mark. Yeah.
It's just this ridiculous Mexican standoff where the Labor Party doesn't want to talk about a transition because they don't want to talk about closing coal power stations or something. I mean, it's pretty obvious what's got to happen. You've just got to have a bit of planning around helping the workforce in those regional areas and the workforce and the community. And you can do that by spending not very much money in the scheme of things, because actually there's not, these industries don't employ all that many people, like it's probably in the order of 10,000 or something like that, which in the scheme of the Australian workforce of 11 million or something like that, it's not huge. So we can absolutely deal with it. And in terms of energy security, when coal plant power stations are closing, our energy system is becoming more secure, because these things break down all the time and we lose hundreds of megawatts, sometimes thousands of megawatts immediately without warning, and it throws the system into chaos. Whereas renewable energy with firming is now cheaper, it's way more reliable, and there's something like 120 gigawatts of proposed new projects in the pipeline, according to the Australian Energy Market Operator. So, we just need to get these coal power stations closed, plan to assist the communities and the workers, provide them opportunities. It could be great. It could be great, but we just need to, bite the bullet. And it just becomes, it's hard because, elements of the media and some conservative politicians, just want to run scare campaigns on us and muddy the waters.
Yeah, if I can chip in on that, Peter, I didn't reinterpret your question as sort of, how do you decide who to be friends with? That there are a range of people out there with different promises and offers. Some are still talking can-do capitalism, but think that, capitalists can get green and lead the way more effectively than hidebound governments who are better at regulating things than making things happen. Well, good luck to them. If they can make a positive contribution, let's have your Mike Cannon-Brookes and other sort of progressive capitalists doing their best. I mean, they are ultimately friends if they achieve things, just like Matt Keane. He certainly seems like a breath of fresh air by the standards of liberal politics, and I welcome and embrace that. But let's see the runs on the board, the changes on the ground, and assess them on their merits. Certainly, we've always got to be on the lookout for spin, whether it's corporate greenwashing or whether it's governments who, with spin doctors like Morrison, who would have you believe, that black is white and night is day. We've got to maintain that critical edge. But in the meanwhile, on a long and difficult journey, I think we can work with whoever declares a commitment to those similar ends. And I don't write people off just because they say, oh, I don't like the sound of that. It sounds a bit like socialism or something. Well, yes, maybe it is, but that's down the track. Let's get started as a broad popular front making the changes that society desperately needs at this stage in human history.
Mark?
Just to add quickly, I'm all in favour of a Green New Deal with huge government intervention. I think we need to. It's absolutely dire situation. But I think we also need to acknowledge that the market has actually thrown up renewable energy development, and the competition with renewable energy has actually provided us with, with this incredible thing that it's now not only is it technically entirely feasible to transition really quickly, but also it's cheaper than what we're doing now. And I think it's undeniable that market competition has contributed to developing that. Could it have happened if we'd had, think tanks of government departments sitting around trying to figure out how to do it? Well, maybe, but there's definitely is. The market has thrown up some amazing technology that's really important to getting us over the line. So I think you need a bit of both.
Okay, and I've got one last thing that I think we should talk about. Today is International Women's Day. The situation of women in the economy is a factor in the election, especially the job security and wage levels, as well as respect and safety. So how do you see this dimension of the election playing for Morrison's election platform and the other parties?
I suppose I should have a go at that one too, although I find it difficult to see much connection between the current government's policies and further progress for women. Indeed, there's some sort of soothing rhetoric, but if you can't even make Parliament House itself a safe workplace for women, I mean, Christ, this doesn't bode well. But the broader, longer struggle for equality of opportunity and equality of rewards in the workplace has been disappointingly slow over many decades, irrespective of which governments are in power. Certainly, you've got to go back to the Whitlam government, I think, for the major springboard it provided with equal pay legislation. And there was a big step up as a consequence of that in terms of wage relativities between women and men. But it stalled. The Howard government years, it started slipping back, and there's been very little progress since. COVID has been a shake-up, of course, because a lot of work done by women has been absolutely central, particularly in health services, of course, to our coping with this crisis situation. And I think it really is time now for a more radical reset. I mean, on a conceptual level, there's no problem here. I mean, in my subject area of political economy, feminists are among the leading contributors to the way in which we think about economic critique, about the development of policy, about the way in which we envisage economic and social progress. But shifting from that sort of conceptual and theorized level into the realm of dirty practical politics is a very difficult transition, particularly where you've got political parties like the Liberals still dominated by males. And I mean, the failure to embrace Julie Bishop as a potential leader, just sums up the fact that there's such a deep-seated gender bias within mainstream politics on the right-hand side that I think 20 years in opposition will give them the breathing space they need to rethink their strategy.
Okay. Thank you very much, Frank. And Mark, do you want to make some comment there?
I think Frank's really, I don't think I can add much to what Frank said, except that, I mean, how bad do you have to be for it not to negatively impact you at the polls? I mean, it's kind of extraordinary, some of the stuff that's happened with this government. And Yeah, look, I just think, the sooner we can get on to, taking those really strong steps to shift to, genuine equality and in pay and conditions and opportunity and representation, the better. Our team at the Australian Institute's Climate and Energy team is now mostly women, and that's been quite a big shift over the last 5 years. Even at the Australian Institute, a really progressive organisation, and it's great. And I think we just have to find ways to speed it up.
Okay, thank you very much. That brings us to the end of the discussion tonight on the topic about the economy, Morrison's election platform. I would like to really thank warmly both Mark Ogge and Frank Stillwell for their contributions. People can't give you the sound and feeling, but I'm sure it's out there for both of you. So thank you very, very much. Now I have to thank Kathy Bogan. She has always been providing the online support for us. She is a member of the Politics in the Pub committee as well, a long time one. And our committee needs some more help, I think. We're struggling to keep it going, but we are keeping it going. However, our next session was going to be in person at Hotel Harry on Sunday, the 20th of March at 2 in the afternoon on the topic health and education in the COVID recovery. So we are keeping on a discussion about how are we going to get out of this terrible trouble we've had with the pandemic and all of the problems it's uncovered and really exposed so sharply. But I'm having trouble getting the speakers which we had for a Tuesday night to be there on a Sunday afternoon. So I think we'll be announcing soon, probably a shift to March 27 to enable some other availabilities there. So keep your eye out for the emails and the Facebook. Politics in the Pub Facebook group is a good way to get announcements. So find the group, not the Facebook page, for Politics in the Pub Sydney. And you can watch the video or tell your friends that the video of tonight's program, for instance, is going to be on www.politicsinthepub.org.au, which connects to our YouTube channel. So thank you very, very much, everybody. It's been another really important session. Good night to all of the people participating online.